We're here with Dr. Waller from Hobart and William Smith College in New York. Glad to be here. And anyway, so where'd you start off studying?
I first encountered institutional economics in my second year of undergraduate education. I had transferred to Western Michigan University in 1975, and I audited a course taught by Louis Junker, who was a student of J. Fag Foster at the University of Denver. And I sat through his Principles of Economics class, which had to be one of the more unique Principles of Economics classes that was around. I don't recall that I think we used Hunt and Sherman as a principles text, and read Studies in the Development of Capitalism by Maurice Dobb, and Jacob Bronowski's Science and Human Values, and Leslie White's The Concept of Culture, which was very different from the standard Principles of Microeconomics I had in my first year in college at Wayne State University, which was a traditional micro class, which pretty much convinced me that I never wanted to study economics, and only audited the class by Junker under the insistence of one of my friends and classmates, Ron Milcarrick. I would say that while I was at Western Michigan, where I completed my bachelor's in science and economics, and did my master's in economics under Lou Junker. I probably took every course he taught during that period of time at least once.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time I decided I was going to study economics, I pretty clearly decided that I would study institutional economics. So when I declared my economics major, I signed up for all the mainstream economics courses that I was required to take in the next semester and completed them so that they were...
In one semester you got
Yes.
pulled the Band-Aid off?
Yeah, I took, intermediate micro, intermediate macro, and statistics.
Mm-hmm.
Just,
Yes.
So in '78 I completed my bachelor's, in '79 I completed my master's, and then decided to do my PhD at the University of New Mexico, largely because David Hamilton was there, a student of Clarence Ayers, and had been there quite some time. When I arrived at New Mexico, I started by taking institutional economics with David Hamilton. It was like there were 4 students in the class, and that was really an eye-opening course for me in that during that period of time, most economics was, taught in the oral tradition, at least out of Denver, and you would read widely in the social sciences, but you were generally studying with one person who would sort of tell you how they saw the literature. So I pretty much had a good hold on how Lou Junker saw the institutionalist tradition. It had never occurred to me that David Hamilton might have a completely different read of that same literature. As a consequence, I began to think about the various strands within institutional economics, and my term paper for that course was something called The Evolution of the Veblennian Dichotomy, which was also the first journal article I published in 1982, 3 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Which talks about just those sorts of things. The concepts of technology and the concepts of institution or ceremony are used differently by institutionalists, who are all assuming that they're all talking about the same thing simultaneously. And so I've always been kind of interested in the construction of our conceptual apparatus. I was fortunate in that Lou Junker suggested, and a group of us decided to, attend the early the Western Social Science Association meetings that became the Association for Institutional Thought meetings. So first of all, I had gotten to meet David Hamilton before I had gone to graduate school there, as well as Professor Sturgeon and Mark Toole, Dale Bush. I got an opportunity to meet J. Fag Foster and some of the other people here who I've worked with over that period of time. That really turned out to be very important that Lou introduced me to those people, because Lou Junker passed away in 1980. And so, an important person in my intellectual development suddenly disappeared, and I must say that his friends and colleagues through AFIT really picked up the mentoring for me. And I owe an awful lot to Mark Toole, Bill Duggar, Ron Stanfield, Dale Bush, all of whom have always been there. Terry Neal and Ann Mayhew, who have always been there reading stuff for me, helping me professionally because of that absence. And of course David Hamilton's been great as well. There were not a lot of other graduate students contemporaneous with me studying with David Hamilton. He had always had students over the years, the most famous probably being Tom DeGregory, who's currently at the University of Houston. And it was almost like he had a plan of reading for me, of which I had no idea why the particular things were selected. So, the first thing I'm reading in institutional economics is Durkheim's The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, which discusses totemic religions, and I'm, what does this have to do with anything? And at the end of the book, there's a footnote by Durkheim that suggests that, economic theory seems an awful lot like one of these totemic religions. And so I was always reading these strange books, what seemed strange to me at the time, that David was recommending, that he clearly, thought was leading somewhere, but I spent most of my time trying to figure out, why am I reading this? I was reading Marcel Mauss's, The Gift, and Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd, and Malinowski, and along with the standard, institutionalist canon, if you will. And one year I ended up reading the complete works of Barbara Wooten, a British economist, an institutional economist, and a very interesting one, a very interesting career. And then it got to be time where I had to sort of write a dissertation, and one of the amazing things about it, the dissertation process, is that one day you decide you're going to do an original piece of work. You decide that in the abstract. There's no necessary correspondence between that time and you having a good idea. So you're at the mercy of the universe in some sense. And Dave handed me a copy of a dissertation by Walter Wagner, a student of Ayers, who then went on to teach at, I think it's somewhere in California. It might be University of Pacific. And in that dissertation, Wagner basically decided to rethink general equilibrium, the concept of general equilibrium, as a system of social reciprocity where all the reciprocal obligations that usually go with social reciprocity were simultaneously met. And when you do that, the interesting thing is general equilibrium is the death of economic activity then. All obligations have been met. There's no reason to come back and do anything else. And so he said, I always thought, David told me, he said, he always thought Walter Wagner should have done something more with this dissertation. And he thought I might think about it and use it as a way of getting a dissertation off the ground. And so ultimately, I did a dissertation on social reciprocity in market economies, reconceptualizing market exchange as just a special case of reciprocity, and looked at how the norms of reciprocity might be used to interpret some elements of market economies, particularly attitudes with regard to transfers, welfare programs that were not reciprocal. Which was a sort of fun thing to do, and I eventually generated a bunch of articles in the JEI on transfer programs on that and other policy issues. While I was writing the dissertation, eventually, Ronald Reagan got elected president, and funding was cut for things like everything the government did. And so, while the department
Except for defense.
the department in New Mexico was very supportive of me financially, I felt some personal need to quit taking up the space of a graduate student while I was reading and get a job. So in 1982 I went on the job market and began interviewing, and the job market was not really very comfortable for heterodox economists, but we all managed to get jobs and had some strange experiences. I interviewed with North Texas State, and the person doing the interviewing was Dick Armey, who went on to bigger and more dangerous things in Congress, and that was to replace Bill Duggar at North Texas State. Didn't get that job, and probably wouldn't have taken it anyway. And I got a very peculiar phone call while I was at the meetings, which were in D.C., from Hobart and William Smith colleges, and I decided to go to this interview, which I did, and the first question they asked me is, are you a nice person? And I said, yes. As a matter of fact, I have a letter of recommendation here from my mother. They laughed, I laughed, and so I went there in 1982, so I guess this must have been 81, on a 1+1 contract. And Hobart and William Smith had decided, independent of my being there, that they were going to teach political economy. They had a young Marxist economist from Cornell named Chris Gunn, who works on worker cooperatives, who had been a very successful teacher there and sort of made their students more interesting, and so they wanted to build a permanent commitment to that and realized they needed to hire some heterodox economists. So they decided to hire one, and they went out onto the market and couldn't decide between two of us. They hired Jerry Newsom, who's now at the EPA, who was trained at Notre Dame, and myself. Jerry moved on to the EPA after 5 years, and I just stayed on year-by-year contracts until they offered me a tenure-track position, got tenure, and I've been there ever since, in a very comfortable and supportive department, which is not made up of heterodox economists, but very good, tolerant, and interesting, classical economists. Chris Gunn is still there, and we did build political economy into the program, so every student takes a course in political economy where they read Marx, Veblen, and Keynes, and some standard methodology stuff, Friedman's famous article, critiques of it, other institutional literature. And after a few years of forcing students to read these huge piles of articles, Chris Gunn, myself, and Randy Albelda decided to put together a reader for teaching that course called Alternatives to Economic Orthodoxy, which has been sort of the text we've used of readings ever since. And so it's really solidly built into the department. I still teach political economy regularly. I teach a course in institutional economics. I teach a course periodically, which is a seminar on the work of Veblen, explicitly. I teach a course called The Economics of Caring, which begins with a philosophical discussion of the ethic of care versus the ethic of justice and how it manifests itself in social thought. Then it's followed by an economic or political history of welfare programs in the United States, a couple of case studies, studies of particular policy formations, literally building from the ethical and moral foundations up to contemporary policy issues. And that's a lot of fun.
How do your students react to that class?
It's the most popular course for entering students on campus. I could teach nothing but this course and it would fill with 35 students every term. Last fall I did it, 2 sections of it was 70 students, and the largest class size we have is 35, so that's the math. Every student's required to do 30 hours of community service in addition to the coursework.
You don't have the Rubik exchange?
No, we actually have a very good program in service learning. So we have an office. For the faculty member, it's simple. You call the office, you say how many students you have, they set up the internships and monitor it, and then you get the feedback from the supervisor at the site. So it's really simple for a faculty member to do that. I decided to start doing that because the best discussions in the concept of caring came from, in the class, came from students who had been in circumstances where they were caring for someone. Now, almost everyone at some point in their life does that, but often these were, in addition to being useful and revelatory, often poignant and difficult. I mean, because when you care for someone, they're obviously in need, and most of their experiences would be with family members. So some students are very comfortable talking about that. Others have those experiences but aren't comfortable sharing them. So putting them out into the community where they had some formal commitment to a social service agency providing care meant that everybody was empowered to talk about it. They could either talk about their experience doing the internship or personal experience, but they were never compelled into this sort of revelatory, confessional approach of talking about their own family experience, and that's worked marvelously well. So it may be my most actually institutional course without ever mentioning institutional economics, because I sort of give them a, poverty level budget and send them into the community to try and attain social services, find places to rent. And being in a small city, Geneva is a small city of about 10,000 people. It's not a village or a suburb. It's a real city.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a social security office there. But it's small enough that all the people who work in those offices know that I do this. So when students come in and say, okay, this is the project I'm doing, they're very willing to jump in and cooperate with them. And it's worked out marvelously. So that's a great teaching experience. I also teach interdisciplinary courses. I teach Women's Narratives of Wealth and Power, which looks at women's writing about the economy, regardless of whether it's formal economic discourse or some discourse written in some other context. So we use Edith Wharton along with Veblen. We use Charlotte Perkins Gilman, both her literary works and her economics works, maybe Joyce Carol Oates in a contemporary setting. And I teach that with Linda Robertson, who's a rhetorician by training, and who I've written quite a bit, both in the JEI and outside the JEI.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my teaching relevant to institutional economics, which at this point almost all of it is. I did my service of teaching intermediate micro for a long time as well.
And what book did you use for that?
For intermediate micro, I used a variety of them. I used, I'll tell you the ones I liked. A long time ago I used Merrick Freeman's intermediate microeconomic analysis, mostly because it was different. It started from a general equilibrium framework. I liked it, the students hated it, because it was different. I then used Donald McCloskey's Applied Theory of Price, which used a lot of economic history to illustrate microeconomics. Again, I liked it. I don't know how the students liked it. I used Varian's Intermediate Microtext. Again, I liked it. 1 chapter per day. Really, it just has a nice organizational structure. I liked it. The students hated it. And so then basically I just try and find the most clearly written partial equilibrium intermediate microtext I can, figuring, well, that's what they really have to learn, and I just grind through it. When I got an opportunity to be department chair, I hired a bunch of good applied microeconomists and haven't looked back or taught the course since. So my one wrestling with power in the economics department I used to liberate myself from the teaching of microeconomics.
So that's the big stronghold that you used there. Well, that's good. So let's first talk about Junker, because he was the first major influence, it seems like, on your career. Give us an idea, because he's no longer around, of the type of person he was, what his vision or philosophy of.
Okay. Lou was a voracious reader. He comes out of the sort of Foster spur off the Ayersian camp, Ayers being Foster's teacher, Foster being Toole, Bush, Edie Miller, and Junker's teacher. So that in effect, if there's a major difference, I think that they had a slightly different view of the Veblenian dichotomy, where that they sort of thought of institutions having both ceremonial and instrumental aspects, and thus trying to tease the aspects out. Clearly Foster took into account more the influence of individual action, individual initiation of new behaviors, and I think Mark Toole's done more than anyone else with that. But I see Junker as probably having leaned in that direction. Lou Junker had read a lot of Marx and intended to see Marx as an institutionalist of sorts, and probably liked Marx's work on alienation, and I must admit that's a part of Marx that I still find I'm very comfortable with. And his reading, every day in class he would come in with another pile of books that he was working through, and any time he was in his office, he was reading. Whenever he was at home, he was reading or gardening. He had a sort of hyperactive personality, very excitable. His classroom was wonderful. I mean, it was just a free-flowing discussion of social theory that, you know, basically you just went in every day and you had this conversation. And I really remember feeling intimidated because the students seemed so knowledgeable. I didn't realize that this Principles in Economics course had PhD sociology students in it, and people from, you know, the business school, and people from, you know, the anthropology department who were taking it just because they wanted to take a course for him. I felt, you know, completely out of my depth, you know, talking about Dobbs' the studies in the development of capitalism and the methodological problems. I'm trying to figure out what the hell happened. You know, it was an incredibly intimidating experience until you realized, you know, there were just a lot of people at a lot of different places, and if you asked a question, this seminar, this free-rolling seminar, they just, of course, tell you. I mean, they help you along. So it was a very supportive intellectual environment for the students. And the rest of the department at Western Michigan was very supportive of students as well. They were not supportive of one another. And Lou Junker was a very volatile person. He would get very excited, very frustrated and angry in intellectual disputes. So he tended to get most frustrated with the people who were closest to him in terms of agreement. I can remember some of the intense arguments he would have at AFIT meetings with people who he agreed with on 98% of things. And he would get so frustrated that he just couldn't make the next step with him that, you know, and eventually that killed him. He had this excitable temperament. He suffered from high blood pressure and never got it under control, really, and that eventually killed him. He was great to his students, abusive of his mainstream colleagues. Many of those who were actually quite supportive of him in spite of disagreeing with his approach. And not a terribly productive scholar in the terms of writing. In many ways, he had sort of begun to hit his stride as an author about the time he died. AFIT was very important to him in terms of going there, presenting papers, and that really began to motivate him to write a lot more. Part of the reason that he was reluctant to write, most of his publications are in the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, though a few early ones are in the early volumes of the JEI. But Lou had gone to graduate school with Warren Samuels, and in fact their families had been quite friendly. And I think in some sense when Warren became the editor of the JEI, there were two things. There were obviously differences of opinion they had, but also sort of being put into a position where he was going to have to submit his work to someone who he viewed as a peer, not as someone who he thought could. So he proceeded to publish most of the stuff in the American Journal of Economics and Sociology and was more comfortable with Will Listner's editorship there. And he was becoming rather productive at the time of his death. He had produced a number of articles, many of which were published posthumously, of course, because of the untimely nature of his death. I think he was only in his 50s, maybe just 50 when he died. At Western Michigan, where they have a terminal master's program during the period of time was there, most of the students who went on into graduate training were Lou's students. And there was a notable group there at the time I was there. Ann Jennings, who I've written with extensively, had graduated from Western with a degree in German and come back to do a bachelor's degree in economics, and then did her master's there as well. And we were there at the same time. Ron Milcarek, who then who I've known since I was a boy. We grew up in the same neighborhood in East Detroit. And he was the reason that he said, you know, why don't you go to Western? So at his suggestion, I transferred there. And he introduced me to Lou. Went and did his PhD in economics at University of Massachusetts. Annie did hers at the University of Utah. Dan Gimbel, who's published some things in the JEI, was also an undergraduate there, and he went to the University of Utah. And Bernadette Lancia was an undergraduate there at the same time. She's published quite a bit in the JEI, and we were actually married for 18 years, so she was at Hobart and William Smith as well, though we never actually co-authored anything. So there was a core of, you know, 5 or 6 graduate students who went on and did PhDs, many of whom have contributed to the development of institutionalism in substantial ways. I've also been very lucky in terms of colleagues at Hobart and William Smith. After they hired Jerry and myself, they got a position in labor economics, and they hired Randy L. Belda, who's now at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, graduated from UMass Amherst, and is a well-known economist, public policy, and she thinks of herself as a Marxist, but I think her work is quite institutional. And that was a very positive experience. Ann Jennings taught at Hobart and William Smith for 6 years. Charles Whalen taught at Hobart and William Smith for 6 years. We've had Andy Piankos, who's done some institutional work. He taught there on and off for a number of years. Well, he was also teaching down at Cornell. We've had a couple of new school graduates, Anuradha Seth, who's now at the World Bank, and Claire Batista, who is now at SUNY Cortland. And we've recently hired 2 political economists from the USC International Political Economy program. So there's always been sort of moving through a core of really interesting heterodox economists during the period of time when Bernie Lancio and myself and Ann Jennings and Charles Whalen were there and Chris Gunn, I think, have to be the most productive times of my career. It was so nice to be able to go into one another's offices and have conversations on a daily basis with regard to our research, and we were all very productive during that period of time. Janice Peterson one time came to visit and said, Hobart and William Smith has the best library in institutional economics in the country. Unfortunately, it's all located in your offices, but it was a very nice time to be working there. There are a lot of institutional economists in upstate New York. Janice Peterson has been at SUNY Fredonia. David Martin's been at one of the SUNY campuses for a long time.
Why do you think they've all located in that?
Well, I can actually explain it.
Yeah.
I can't think of the name right now. It's embarrassing. Down at Cornell in the ILR school, Vernon Briggs has been down at Cornell for 1,000,000 years. There are a couple reasons I think that there have been institutionalists in upstate New York that has to do with the large number of small liberal arts colleges, the influence of Cornell and Columbia on higher education in upstate New York, Polanyi in the Columbia years, Morris Copeland down at Cornell for years, and a lot of economists in the area. John Gams was in Hamilton for his entire career. So there's always been sort of a presence in those universities and small colleges, and so in their curriculum there's already built sort of if not a flexibility that can accommodate that, and a willingness to accommodate it. Small liberal arts colleges might end up with more heterodox economists simply because of hiring constraints. They have less money than the big research institutions, and so they're on the market. They're looking for the best economists to teach classes they can get, and so when they go into the market, of the best economists that are left that aren't taking very high-paying jobs, disproportionately, and quality-wise, the best economists we get to choose from tend to be heterodox. So my department has not hesitated, even when it was not slotted as one of the heterodox positions, if often the best environmental economist we can get is going to be a heterodox economist, and so we'll hire them. So there's no reason not to. And we're all trained so that, a heterodox environmental economist, if they're an environmental economist, they can teach a standard environmental economy.
How do you think your department's managed to do that? Because you hear so much struggle between different places, and it seems like you've been very fortunate.
Well, there's a mistake. I
Got you.
Ultimately, we have a group of people who discovered that when they began to offer heterodox courses, enrollment grew. And as a consequence, they were able to apply for more positions and get them. And it also freed them up. In a small department, an overworked department teaching a lot of mainstream stuff, everybody's got to be teaching it all the time. As you get more people, then a lesser proportion of each person's time is going to be spent teaching principles and intermediate micro. So this sort of freed us all up to teach courses in institutional economics and, in my case, or women's narratives of wealth and power. Well, it's had the same effect for the classical economists. They may one of our classical economists is a development economist, and of course he does his best work in development by virtue of it being applied. So yeah, he's got to teach macroeconomics, but now he's teaching these interesting courses and aspects of development and on Africa. Mm-hmm. Makes him a better teacher, makes him a happier person, makes him a more productive researcher, and he realizes this is because he doesn't have to spend all his time teaching intermediate macroeconomics. So it's worked to everyone's benefit. Part of it is it's a pretty tight age cohort. We're probably all within 15 years of one another in terms of age and training. And we all get along well on a personal basis. And in fact, when we hire, it's sort of like, well, let's get the best economists we can who we might have to look at for the next 25 years of our lives, So
Do you still ask the question? Do they still ask the question, are you nice?
No, they don't. That was actually highly particular. There was obviously a story there.
Yes.
They had a person before me who they had fired for basically swapping grades for sex with his female students, who was an unmitigated disaster and brought all kinds of negative feelings towards the department. So basically, yes, they wanted someone to do heterodox economics, but they were desperate for someone who was going to rehabilitate them, or at least was not going to embarrass them by completely antisocial and inappropriate behavior.
Okay, I did not. Wouldn't have expected that answer, but hey.
I know, it's very strange. I was a little shocked myself. I didn't discover it immediately until they began to introduce me to other colleagues in the colleges who, I'd go to a new faculty meeting and the provost would say, oh, this is Bill Waller, and I'd reach out and shake their hands. They'd say, he's in economics, and my colleagues would pull their hands back and walk away. It's like, what is it? I remember turning to the provost at the time and said, you obviously left something out. You didn't tell me about something here that's leading to this sort of response.
Have any of your students obviously gone on to graduate school?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've had a couple of students go and do master's degrees at Colorado State. I have a former student named Sandra Rivera who did a master's at New Mexico, then did her PhD at Kentucky, and is an economist at the International Trade Commission. I have a student right now, Kanchana Ruanpura, who's finishing up at Cambridge. She's writing her dissertation under Jane Humphreys, who has since moved to Oxford, but she was at Cambridge during the period of time when Jane Humphreys, Tony Lawson, and Jeff Hobson were all there. She also did a master's at Notre Dame. So she's probably the most institutionally trained student I've ever turned out. She'll be finishing up shortly. One of my students actually went to Yale Law School, a young African-American woman named Kathy Scarborough. And kind of an odd thing, but she actually ended up becoming the chief counsel of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So in many ways, she's in economics on a permanent basis as well. A lot of students going off getting master's degrees, public policy degrees, law degrees. Very few in going on into economics at the PhD level. And I must say I don't encourage it, as I said in today's talk. Yeah. I think that if you want to be a useful economist, then the first thing you need to do after your undergraduate degree is get out in the world and find out what it's like. And if you want more academic training, go get some tools on a master's of public policy program. And then if you still think you want to fight the hard fight in economics, then you go and get a PhD in economics and enter the academy or research think tanks or something like that. Because it's really hard, as I said in my talk today, if you're going to be a heterodox economist, you can forget about the Nobel Prize and the endowed chair at one of the Ivy Leagues. You're going to have to teach mainstream economics and heterodox economics, and to get the same, to get tenure and recognition, you're going to have to write twice as much as your neoclassical colleagues. And you're going to have to recognize that some people will just, as soon as they find out that you do anything heterodox, turn you off. So that you're going to have to be a better economist, and you're going to have to work in a more hostile environment than I think most people just beginning their PhDs expect. I remember I was finishing my dissertation. I was in David Hamilton's office. It was the summer I finished up, and he was talking about his own career, and he said, if I had it to do all over again, I'd be an anthropologist. And all I can remember thinking is, you couldn't mention this 4 years ago. because this time I'm working as an economist, and it's not like I'm going to go do something else or even reconsider, sort of path dependency. I had to sort of,
You got a lot.
yeah, there's a certain level of lock-in. I have no other skills. I'm going to teach economics or do economic research someplace.
So you've basically been a teacher for your life. That's in your basic.
I haven't worked in any explicitly research jobs. I did work for a while for General Motors between degrees in industrial engineering, sort of as an inspector and things of that sort. But no, I've been an academic economist. I write a lot, so to say, and I have a reasonable teaching load, 2 courses per term. So I've had a pretty strong research and teaching career, I think. I'm pretty happy with it.
What associations are you a member of?
Of course, the Association for Evolutionary Economics, where I've served as a board member and acting secretary-treasurer. I've been on the editorial board of the JEI for at least 1 term and been a referee for the association for years and years. I'm in the Association for Institutional Thought. I'm a past president of the association, so I was also program chairman and vice president and on the board for quite a long time. At the time it seemed like forever. Since I'm in AFIT, I'm also a member of Western Social Sciences, which is typical. I'm a member of the International Association for Feminist Economists. I go to their conferences pretty regularly, give papers, and I haven't served on the board, though I've declined invitations to serve on the board a couple of times. My feeling is that there are plenty of board memberships for old boys like myself, and the feminists really probably ought to
Take it.
Yeah, they should give it to young women who are moving up in the profession to get that experience rather than me. I've been on enough boards. I'm a member of the Association for Social Economics, and I go to their meetings occasionally. I've served on the board of that association as well. I referee for a lot of different journals. I don't actually pay much attention except when I'm there in a review back, mostly for the JI, but other ones as well. Other associations. I've been in the International Thorstein Veblen Association, and I go when they have their meetings in New York because it's easy to go, and I can take a dose of nothing but Veblen for a weekend about every other year. That's
I know that. My first experience I went to an AFIT meeting and I got heavy dose. It seemed like a Veblen Common and Errors.
Yes.
And at the end of it, I was just wondering. I was like, okay, I kind of read the Theory of Leisure class before, but I was just like, man, this is.
Yeah, there's a point at which these people, and I'm included. I don't differentiate myself. You spend a little too much time on this, but it's fun. It's nice to go someplace where other people are doing what you're doing and share your interests, even if you're not learning a great deal. At least you're reassuring yourself that you're not completely insane, or if you're insane, you're insane in the same way as a large number of other people.
Yeah. Okay, let's shift a little bit here.
Okay.
What do you feel that there's a possible synthesis, or what lines you feel cross between other heterodox economic groups and institutionalists in particular, and how much are they saying the same story from a different perspective, or are they on a completely different ball field?
Well, I would first begin empirically, in the sense that I think a large number of post-Keynesians and institutionalists have come to recognize that they're complementary parts of possibly the same research program. I don't want to use the neoclassical distinction that you have post-Keynesian macro and institutionalism might be the micro foundation. I think that's sort of accepting a dualistic interpretation of the economic world that we don't want to carry with us. But I think that, as Fred Lee's work illustrates, as you begin to look at the when you begin to look at the component parts of a post-Keynesian analysis, you're looking at social institutions. So I think those are complementary research programs that are kind of moving in the same direction, and may ultimately end up being one big tent. Much of the work with the so-called social economists is institutional economics coming from a different starting point. These are people who have the same concerns, and are developing similar tools, but they may not have had the training in institutional economics, so they are sort of working from sociology or social theory and coming in the same direction. I'm not even sure those groups are distinct. I think if you look down the membership lists of the Association for Social Economics and the Association for Evolutionary Economics, the degree of overlap would be absolutely horrifying. You know, it may just be the way that we keep several journals going simultaneously. The feminist economists, I think, have the most interesting discourse going in economics, because most of the feminist economists come to economics from a substantive set of problems involving the role of gender in understanding the economy. So in fact, these are people who came to economics to study women, the role of women in society, the role of women in the economy, and the particular paradigm that they're working in is as much a historical, biographical accident as anything. So when they get together, you have neoclassical economists, you have, you know, Austrian economists, post-Keynesian economists, institutional economists, all the varieties of Marxism, all coming together to talk about the same topics. And these topics they are deeply, deeply committed to, which gives them an incredible incentive to try and talk across paradigmatic boundaries and be understood. So I see an openness and an exchange there that is really healthy, almost a model for the rest of economics. Empirically, the interesting thing is particularly those outside the feminist economists outside the United States, when they're exposed to institutional economics, begin to self-identify that way. Prue Hyman, who's a very important economist in New Zealand, was presenting her basically empirical case studies on women, and someone said, "Oh, you're in institutional economics." So she came to a session on institutional feminism being done by Anne Mayhew and Janice Peterson and Janet Knabler, and she said, "You know, oh my gosh, I'm an institutional economist." And you know, Nancy Fulbright plugged along for a million years within the sort of margins of neo-Marxism as a dual systems theorist, arguing that patriarchy was a mode of production along with class conflict, you know, conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And as she worked in the Marxian tradition, she eventually got to the point where she's self-identifying now as an institutionalist. So I think that there are real opportunities for institutionalism there to bring to this group an understanding that their substantive work is really pretty institutional, and the terminological differences that they're overcoming will make that easier for them to do. So I think that's a good place for overlap. I think we should really, you know, be encouraging, particularly of young people who are coming out of the new institutionalism, because they'll eventually run into the same brick walls all of us ran into with neoclassical economics, is where subject matter and neoclassical economics sort of ran out of steam. I mean, that's, when you talk to someone like Douglas North, that's, you know, couldn't do what he needed to do with neoclassical, so tried to do something different, and maybe did do something different. I don't know. I don't know if I can really assess that. But his students, if they continue down that same track, I expect they'll begin to look for solutions to problems they encounter, and that would be a fruitful area of sharing. We should always look to see what other people are doing, because even by accident they're going to come up with something. You can't be wrong 100% of the time. I think there's some real barriers. I think that the equilibrium concept is a poison pill. If people are going to insist on looking for equilibrium, I don't think there's a whole lot for institutionalists to talk to them about. You know, when you're focused on evolutionary change, the notion of a static equilibrium is just, you're not even asking the same kinds of questions anymore. So, you know, you can argue over whether one view represents reality better or not, but there's not an opportunity for synthesis over that particular issue. There are other ways in which there are conflicts that would be difficult to overcome. Though when I look at the post-structuralist or postmodern Marxist, you know, if you had told me 10 or 15 years ago that there would be people self-identifying as Marxist who were going to start from the premise that dialectical materialism was irrelevant and that the labor theory of value was unnecessary, and that they were willing to throw all that open and maybe even argue that their very structured economistic notions of class weren't the beginning and end of all social conflict, I wouldn't have believed you. I mean, that was sort of how I understood Marxism, as a particular method and a particular set of concepts that were designed to discover the laws of motion of capitalism, and I had difficulty with that. But these Marxists are putting all that on the table to re-examine themselves, and I think that that means that there are some really useful comments in Marx, useful concepts in Marxism, some useful Marxian analysis over which we can have a fruitful discourse and a fruitful sharing of ideas. So, well, I don't see, sort of a convergence there. I think a more fruitful conversation can take place in those places than others.
Where do you see the future of the heterodox groupings or whatever as they clash with the, just use the term orthodox?
Yeah.
I mean, where do you see the one group to continue? Do you see it to be at an equilibrium now, or do you see that?
If all economics, orthodox and heterodox, is going to be taught in economics departments, in some sense we've hit a wall. There's not, every department of thinking people realizes there should be some attempt to deal with the history of economic thought as a discipline, economic history as a subject matter. They may not require it, but they recognize the legitimacy of it. And I would say most institutions most educational institutions and economics departments think if they could have everything they wanted, it would not be a bad idea to have a person who would teach history of thought, economic history, comparative systems, heterodox economics, and everything else they know absolutely nothing about. So I don't think it's so negative that there's no room for participating, but I think there's a limit to it. Economics, mainstream economics, as all disciplines, has grown, expanded, done more things. They want to cram it into the curriculum, and I think heterodoxy remains marginal. So if that's the only place heterodox economics, the only way heterodox economics is going to be taught, it's going to be hard. I'm glad to see that disciplinary boundaries are breaking down in our universities. I think that's a very healthy thing. Because when you're in a public policy program, or a social theory program, or an environmental studies program, or even a business school, where people are coming and looking at the same problem from a variety of different perspectives, in that circumstances, intellectual purity, ideological purity, is not even a very interesting question. So I think the growth of interdisciplinary programs, the growth of public policy programs, is really going to create more and more space for heterodox economists.
Go ahead. Hang on, just an institutional barrier.
Thank you.
I take that as sort of a positive sign. At my own institution, we have someone in sociology who teaches, the political economy of development. And now, I could see that there are institutions where that would create a turf battle. Well, who's going to... But, we teach a course in economic development. And they don't see themselves as competing interests, but sort of complementary. We have a very good sociologist who teaches a course on the political economy of South Africa, and he really is teaching about the political economy of South Africa, so why would we say, well, you're not an economist, so we've welcomed that, the economic historian and the history department, we sort of welcome that as an interdisciplinary contribution to the subject matter that students should have the opportunity to study, and I think that, again, is a healthy sort of thing. As the other social sciences begin to intrude on us, as we've always, colonized them intellectually, it creates more opportunities for more people to work together. Cornell, which is near me, is a very interesting institution because it has so many economics departments. In the College of Arts and Sciences, they have an economics department, but they have an economics group at the Industrial Labor Relations School, where Vernon Briggs is. The planning school has Lourdes Beneria, a radical economist, a feminist economist. The College of Human Ecology has a consumer economics department. there's a business economics department. And so this creates circumstances where non-mainstream economists hook up with these other programs and have positions, and brings together community of economists who might engage in some serious exchange. The flip side of that is that most of the economists at Cornell don't talk to one another, so across those boundaries.
Yeah.
But in terms of talking to the rest of the world, I think that creates more opportunities for heterodox economists. And I think that the development, both at the Levy Institute and here at the University of Missouri Kansas City at the Center for Full Employment and Employee Stability, those research notes and the ability to get thought, policy ideas out into the media has been very, very good. Having those policy papers available, we've been very fortunate in the last few years. Charles Whalen taking a position at Business Week means that a lot of that work is finding its way into Business Week, and a heterodox economist at Colorado State, Alexandra Bernaszak, her sister is a reporter at Fortune. And so all of a sudden we're seeing some of your policy notes and the Levy policy notes finding their way into Fortune magazine. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. It's a good thing if you start to, on the general level, people hear differing ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Greenspan might not be right 100% of the time.
Sure, and then, when business people are going to go to a seminar or a round table or something, and if they've read that, there were some alternative perspectives in Fortune, then it must be legitimate. If they've read about their some alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
In Business Week, this is hardly an organ of the radical left-wing press in America. It's Business Week, for Pete's sakes. Well, if it's in there, then you can talk about it. And the people who go to those things can insist that it be talked about. You can't just wheel out the usual suspects from the St. Louis Fed to say the same thing over and over again.
Are you sure about that?
Well, you can, but
yeah.
All of a sudden Levy is attracting influential people. You folks are attracting influential people to come here and listen to what you're saying because you're saying something different and it resonates. The ability to get that out there so that people know that there's an alternative is crucial.
I had no idea about your program at Hobart and William Smith.
Mm-hmm.
If I had, I don't even know if I would have studied because I didn't know about economics, but it sounds like your program is a very well-rounded and diverse program.
Yeah, I think it is. I think I've been very lucky.
Sounds to be, yeah, it seems that you've been very lucky. And the place you ended up, and you seem to be a nice guy.
Yeah,
so
I think that, most of the time they think I'm a nice guy, and I haven't done anything that got them any negative media attention quite like this other fellow,
Yeah. Well, do you have any last comments that you want to say or talk about?
No, not offhand.
No?
I've had an opportunity to work with a lot of good people. The people in AFIT and AFI did a great job at mentoring. I love the AFI Summer School. This is my second time through boot camp.
Mm-hmm.
I participated in the first one, and that's really encouraging because I see a lot of young people. And the first time I did, then when those people showed up at the national meetings and such, I knew who they were. I went to hear their papers. I had some idea what they were working on.
How did these two schools, are they fairly similar, or?
It was a smaller enterprise the last time.
Uh-huh.
There were only 20-some students. They weren't quite as diverse as this group. I've seen a fair number of the people who were students there at subsequent meetings, and they've presented work, and that's been very rewarding. The conversations were interesting. There was a little too much lecture at the first one, and I really enjoyed when we broke out and talked about their research, and we did a lot more of that here in Kansas City, and I think we should do even more.
Yeah.
I have a very selfish reason for that. I've been going to the AFIT meetings since Professor Sturgeon and his friends founded it, and when Professor Sturgeon gives a paper, I know pretty much where it's going to go from knowing it. And of course, students bring all kinds of new stuff, so I get all excited about what they're doing. The other thing is that I learned institutional economics by being an apprentice. And I worked with two institutional economists and learned how to do case study work, how to analyze case study work, how to, and it's, you learn this stuff through time. If you're not in a program where you have that opportunity, you're not going to learn some of the techniques and pitfalls. Last night I was talking to Gary Dimsky about a survey that some colleagues of his did, where they, purchased 20,000 addresses and sent this incredibly complex survey to these people, got a return of 150. And then he tells, he reports what's in the survey, and of course the people they sent the survey to couldn't answer the questions, had no idea how to answer the questions. When you've worked with somebody on a lot of survey research, you realize you have to pre-test these things. Yeah, and just some of the simple things. If you're going to set up focus groups, you do a couple of practice ones to, and people who, get into the academy and have never done applied work, they make some egregious mistakes that, if there was someone there to go, you might want to think about this. It's not that they couldn't think of it themselves, it's that they, for some reason, are thinking about so many things they've done. And so I found in our breakout groups, people were talking about their projects, and I was able to just, I would never have put it in my lecture because it's like, well, you might want to try doing this. You might want to meet with this group of people and have two stages rather than one stages of the interview. This is where you allow them to talk in a free form around it, and then you get to your, little technique things about doing research that, you would ordinarily pick up along the way. Just being able to talk to somebody about what they're doing. Sort of taking that ever important, possibly most important part of the professional conference, and that is the conversation after the paper's in the bar, where you get those little things, what's so-and-so working on, what problem did you run into, and how to solve them. Because we don't have an institutionalist department where we can send people to get all these sorts of tips in the context of their day-to-day work. We're often busy learning neoclassical economics and how they do their work as well as institutional economics.
Yeah.
So I would like to do more of that. By the same token, you have to have enough of a common foundation to have a shared language, so it's a tension. And if FE boot camp went on another few days, I think I'd be dead. So 5 days from morning to night is just too long.
I know I would I would run another red light.
Yeah, it's just too intense,
Yes. Yes.
And there's a point in the day when you're sitting there and watching and listening, and it's like my eyes are tired. If I close my eyes, will someone think I'm sleeping rather than just going? In order to focus on what's being said, I have to remove some stimuli. It's an intense experience. There are other great things about it. I mean, I've liked Gary Dimsky's work for a long time, but I've always been hearing him presented at conferences, which, 20 minutes is nothing. It's not enough time to get a sense of it. So we got to hear him for an hour or two, and that's really nice. That's a real luxury. Short of actually going and taking a class from him or working with him on a project for a year, you're not going to get the kind of exposure unless you bring them up for a seminar or something. So it's been a good experience. And one of the things that's important, of course, is I got lucky. The person who introduced me passed away, and his colleagues and friends jumped in to pick up that mentoring role. That was absolutely crucial. I mean, they never have you take a class how to write a journal article, any more than they have one on how to write a dissertation. And them jumping in has made all the difference. This creates that opportunity in a more formally structured way. And I mean, there aren't a lot of institutionalists in my generation. There just aren't. If you look at people writing in the journal between the ages of 35 and 45, there's not a huge number there. And as a consequence, part of that is as the program's diminished, there weren't replacements, and getting people together and seeing that there is actually a community of scholarship that we're working in is going to be helpful.
Yeah, that's a good thing too.
Yeah, and I can't stress the importance of the AFIT meetings.
Yeah.
If you want to do institutional economics, you got to go to the AFIT meetings. It's where you get to practice writing papers. It's where you get to give your first paper, where no one is going to get up and walk out of the room because they think they can go hear a better one. I mean, it's just a very supportive intellectual community for people doing heterodox work where you get good, useful feedback and support and make the connections that you're going to need. AFI meetings are interesting, but they're too busy. Being embedded in applied social sciences, there's too many people. It's too hard to get together with anyone. And most of us are doing other work. I mean, I heard no papers this year because I was on a hiring committee and during AFI. But when I go to AFIT, you know, that's what I'm there for. That's the activity. You know? So I think it's probably, aside from this, the most important mentoring structure we have in the profession right now. It's also important for those of us who are in a position to hire to know who's available. You know, I mean, there's so much of hiring young economists. You now get 350 applications for every position, regardless of how you advertise it. And a good, 25% of those are, the wrong fields or things of that sort. But when you're going through, they're highly formalized. You got the cover letter, you got the vita, you got the laudatory letters of, a couple chapters from the dissertation. And you learn how do you decide who you're going to interview or who you're not going to interview. Well, the legitimate information you can bring into that without being discriminatory is, do you know the people? Do you know the kind of work they do? Do you know the quality of work they do? I mean, that's a legitimate thing to talk about in the hiring committee. The other thing is, as we recruit faculty, minority faculty, or people in heterodox economics, you got to know where they are. If you're hiring a heterodox economist, what are you going to do? Send the ad to Harvard? I mean, you won't find one there, or at least not. You might, but it'd be kind of a fluke. You need to know that there are programs like this, or that so-and-so is teaching and they may have a student, or that, how would I know that there were a lot of people at Leeds? Why would I know that, I don't get there much at all, I would have no way of knowing that. So then when I see someone who's interested in applying for a position in macroeconomics coming from Leeds, it's going, oh, well, that might be interesting, If I see someone from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, it helps to know that. Yeah. And if I know the person, I can say, yeah, this person's been teaching for a while, and for us, that's really important. You're not going to get tenure at my shop unless you can teach, and there are naturals, and there are people who've done some teaching, and that's, if you don't hit the ground running, these students will eat you up, because they really expect incredibly high quality teaching at these small and large colleges, which is an important thing for the program here. If you're really going to target those jobs, and I think you should. Man, they got to get you folks in a classroom.
That's one of the couple of criticisms I would have to say right now about the program.
And you don't want to take a job at Colgate and learn how to teach there, because
I'll get chewed up.
Well, the students are just impatient.
Yeah.
In the way that students at state universities.
Well, I had my micro teacher at Gettysburg College, new out of Berkeley. Man, it was a horrible experience. Just a new PhD. I mean, nice guy. Didn't have really a problem with him, but man, did he get chewed up. It was just like...
Yeah, we had Matt Forstatter interview with us at Hobart William Smith, an initial interview at the meetings, and his fields weren't right for us. But you meet him and you go, this guy's going to be gangbusters in the classroom.
Oh yeah,
no doubt about it.
Yeah.
So you want to hire people like that, but I gotta believe there was a period of time when Matt was not a great. You learn those skills, or you have them. Practice makes perfect.
Simulation.
If you folks have any later questions or follow-up questions, just give me a call.
I will do that.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. It was good time here. Summer school, because I have a